There's a joke that always used to stump me as a kid. It goes a little something like this. Why is an elephant big, gray, and wrinkled? Because if it were small, white, and smooth, it would be an aspirin.
See, I still don't find it very funny. And I think that's because it just made me think too much.
What exactly is an elephant anyways? Because an elephant doesn't have to be big. We could think of a small elephant, right? And an elephant doesn't have to be gray either. We could have an elephant that's white, and we just call that a white elephant. And if we squeeze our brains a little, we can probably think of a smooth-skinned elephant. The philosopher Aristotle subscribed to a school of metaphysics known as essentialism, which is the belief that any classification of things has certain essential properties. These are non-changing properties that define a thing in a specific category. Any other property would be considered accidental. So, an elephant is not essentially big, gray, and wrinkled, but rather accidentally so. But if you change enough of these accidental properties, all of a sudden, the elephant is an aspirin. So where do you draw the line? At what point does an elephant stop becoming an elephant? I would like to introduce to you now one of my favorite phenomena to explode in popularity in the past few years. Anime! Now, this used to be considered a niche Japanese animation industry, but now it has firmly established itself across the world as a dominant form of entertainment. Now, most people can point at a show and say, yes, that looks like an anime. But if you really sit them down and ask them, what makes an anime, things start to get a little bit more complicated, especially if you bring up shows that are on the fence of that definition. Such as this one, for example. Now, I am bound by copyright law, so these are all drawings of my own, but I really recommend looking it up on your own, just so you can get a better reference of how these shows are supposed to look. But anyways, this is Avatar: The Last Airbender. To most people outside of the discourse, they might look at this and say, yes, that looks rather anime-like. Except that many would argue that this show is not, in fact, an anime, simply because it was produced by an American company, Nickelodeon. And because it was not produced in Japan, it is therefore not an anime. So then, is nationality the essential quality of anime? And this is origin, the first property that I wanted to discuss today. It is the most common and probably the most easy factor to defend. Because, well, this is Japan. Everything animated within this archipelago would be considered anime. Everything outside of it, not anime. Easy as that. Except, if we really want to define anime as made in Japan, we need to first know what made in Japan actually means. It could be interpreted in a few different ways. Let's say made in Japan means it needs to have an original story from Japan. Well, if we follow this definition, then something like Studio Ghibli's Howl's Moving Castle would not be considered an anime, because it is an adaptation of a book from British novelist Diana Wynne Jones. So in this case, it would not be an anime. Let's try again. Let's say made in Japan means it has to be produced in Japan. Well, that would be fine, except for the fact that many Japanese studios now outsource their work to a lot of different countries, such as China, Korea, even India now. In fact, actually, a studio, Toei Animation, they've been outsourcing their work since the 1970s. So this one doesn't seem to work either. Let's try made in Japan means it has to be first distributed in Japan. This would be fine, except that a Japanese animated show like Space Dandy would not be an anime, because it was first distributed in the United States. So that doesn't seem to work. Let's try tweaking it a little. Let's just say it has to be distributed in Japan, regardless of where it first aired. Well, if we follow this definition, then the Japanese dub of SpongeBob SquarePants would also be an anime. And I like to think that most of us agree there's something about SpongeBob SquarePants that makes it not an anime. But as you can see, no matter how we try to define made in Japan, it seems to either exclude a show that is commonly accepted to be an anime, or includes a show that is commonly accepted to not be anime. So clearly there's something else going here. Culture. I've been told many times that anime is a medium specifically for telling Japanese stories from a Japanese perspective meant for Japanese audiences. Anime is anime when it reflects Japanese culture. And for most cases, this does seem to work. You have your slice of life shows about Japanese high school life, Japanese work life. That's why you have shows like Keion or Wotakoi. Even fantasy shows where the main character is transported to another world. That's your isekai there. Even those seem to showcase many Japanese social issues, as the protagonists are often shown to be hikikomori, or social recluses that often spend months or years locked up indoors and online. So it showcases modern Japanese isolation and escapism. Except that we also have shows like Vinland Saga. Let me just show a synopsis here. The war between England and the Danes grows worse with each passing year. Thorfinn must take his revenge and kill Askeladd, the man who murdered his father. The only paradise for the Vikings, it seems, is the era of war and death that rages on. There isn't a single shred of Japan in this entire story. But to bar Vinland Saga from being called an anime would seem simply preposterous. And if we're going on the basis of culture, what does that mean for a show like, again, Avatar, which has lots of Japanese influence as seen in its characters and worlds such as Fire Lord Ozai and the Fire Nation? If people still want to insist that Avatar The Last Airbender is not an anime, then culture cannot be the only defining factor, and it cannot be the only essential quality. There must be something else. Style. Is anime an art style? If so, then what are its qualities? Many people see the anime style as 2D, hand-drawn animation. But if this is the case, then that means a 3D computer-generated show, such as Land of the Lustrous, would not be considered anime. Let's try something else. Would the anime style be semi-realistic humans with model-like proportions, spiky colored hair, and enlarged eyes? Well, if that's the case, what about anything that the company Sanrio produces, like the show Agretzko, or, as you might be familiar with, Hello Kitty? There isn't a single human in sight. So this is where things get really blurry. What about the idea that the anime style has a low frame rate or a choppy frame rate, dynamic camera movements with lots of action poses? If that's the case, then what do we have to say about, let's say, Hollywood's movie Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse? Would that be considered an anime? Because it also has choppy frame rates and lots of dynamic poses. What about all the other films that this movie has influenced, such as, let's say, Sony's Mitchells vs. the Machines, or Riot Games' Arcane, or DreamWorks' Puss in Boots, The Last Wish? And I don't want to get into too many of these, but as you can see, once again, no matter how you define this thing, you are either excluding things that are commonly accepted to be anime, or including things that are maybe a little bit more on the fence. So where do I stand in this? To that I say, it's a bit complicated, but I do have an answer. I like to think of anime as an art movement that originated in Japan, but has since then expanded elsewhere. Now, I like to also think of it as the same way we study European art history. So you have your classicism, Romanticism, Impressionism. Actually, Impressionism is an interesting one because it, like anime with Japan, has a distinct birth country in a place, for Impressionism's sake, it's in France. Except that nobody ever says that Impressionist art has to be produced in France or has to reflect French culture necessarily. Furthermore, it's also hard to pinpoint what Impressionism is exactly, just like the same way we do with anime. Visible brushstrokes, for example, are a common feature, except that they also slowly started to develop into other techniques, such as pointillism, divisionism, those of which are categorized as neo-impressionist, not impressionist. So where really do you draw the line? The same thing could be said for anime. Can you really stay authentic to anime if it really started developing and changed since the 1960s, where it really started? This is why I like the definition of art movements, because it takes into account the change that occurs with these art forms as time goes on. That's why nowadays you might even hear about anime paintings or anime video games. We are no longer restricted to the video format. The same way that Impressionism also evolved into Impressionist literature and Impressionist music. So things change, as you can see. But does that mean there really is no stable criteria? And I think a little bit, yeah, you do kind of have to go with your gut here. If this phenomenon, if this art form is pervasive enough in society, you can more easily grasp a general idea of what fits and what doesn't. Dare I say it, it's almost a bit of a spectrum. So, luckily for art, this is why I love art so much. Your opinion on what counts and what doesn't isn't going to directly impact somebody's identity or somebody's autonomy. And therefore, it is a lot more forgiving if you choose to disagree with me. And that's why I like it so much. It's just that there's so much information in the world right now that our brains are trained to categorize everything, to place labels, and to put everything into these neat little boxes so that the world can just be a little bit easier to understand. That's why Aristotle's idea of essentialism is so appealing to us, because it tells us that everything has innate, inseparable qualities that allow us to always differentiate between two different things. The problem is, though, that these definitions, these categories, they're still constructs, and they don't exist in reality, and therefore they are subject to change with us. And people are changing. People are constantly questioning pre-existing ideas and exploring new ones. I like to consider art as the frontier for this exploration. That's why, as an artist, I really, really strongly discourage trying to set up new barriers and new definitions, especially in this field of study, because in art, somebody, I don't know who, is going to rise up and smash those barriers into bits. Instead, I would suggest looking at things as a whole, see where they generally seem to be headed, and then just push this art movement in the direction that you want. Think of these definitions not as really hard rules to follow by, but rather think of them as your suggestions, fuzzy suggestions. So if you really, really think hard, squeeze your brain a little, an elephant is sort of like a weird aspirin, a really, really weird aspirin. And if an elephant can be a weird aspirin, I think Avatar can be an anime. Thank you.